Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Telegram, and Facebook, as well as supporting me on Subscribestar, Locals, and Buy Me a Coffee, as well as check out my Substack. Now, we haven't really talked about this yet, but one of the dreams that I have is having a sort of like think tank. So using hyperstition to create it, I have the Doomsman, my resident expert on H P Lovecraft.
Hello there, Todd. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, now we met at the event this summer, and it was really nice to meet someone else who was as into and well versed in Lovecraft as myself. He's a lot of people like him. He's kind of like a shibboleth in our circles, but very few people have taken the deep dive.
I don't think he gets adequate credit either, because he really is a spectacular writer, at least in terms of, well, a lot of what we're going to be talking about. Some of his lesser known works, I think, are some of his more literary ones. So yeah, he's I think that also shows through sort of in the way that he's been influential, sort of in the background, a writer's writer. Now, granted, there's been massive sort of popular crossover, everybody with the Cthulhu plushies and all. But, given that for, over 50 years after his death, he was fairly unknown, goes to show there's an appeal that's not immediately obvious.
Right. Needless to say, there's going to be a lot of spoilers as well. So if you haven't read Lovecraft and, read them first, or if you don't care, then, okay, there you go. It doesn't matter. So for today, though, I want to first differentiate between two corpuses of his, right? Most people are familiar with his Cthulhu Mythos, which has, of course, the monster Cthulhu, Call of Cthulhu. Also, you have the old ones, the old ones in the Mountains of Madness, the deep ones with the Shadow over Innsmouth, the Great Race of Yith and the Shadow Out of Time, and other creepy crawly monsters from this mythos. And that's where we get the technical, the horror aspects of Lovecraft. But there's this other side, which very few people seem to be aware of, and it centers around Randolph Carter, who's actually introduced in the Cthulhu Mythos with the Last Testament of Randolph Carter. But it's the Dream Cycle is a completely parallel work, which is noted. It does have some horror elements, especially the Quest for Unknown Kadath, but it's not primarily about that. And in fact, even in Unknown Kadath, the horror elements take a back seat to the Dream Cycle. And so what I've looking at this, right? It's almost like Lovecraft, who's writing the Cthulhu Mythos, is a sort of tortured mind or of an unsettled mind. But the Lovecraft who's writing the Dream Cycle is his, well, for lack of a better word, his true self. And we're getting more of a true expression of what motivates Lovecraft. Again, not to get too far ahead, because we will be covering the Dream Cycle separately. And through the Door of the Silver Key, it opens up with a critique by Randolph Carter of the atheists of his own day, whom he goes so far as to say, in viewing everything as meaningless, were more false than the misguided religionists of before. So that's actually quite a strong statement from Lovecraft, who was a well-known atheist.
Yes, and I just wanted to touch on one thing that you mentioned there about the Dream Cycle being a sort of parallel path. I would say that's mostly true, but not quite entirely, because it does touch, like there are touch points between the Dream Cycle and the Cthulhu Mythos, where there are things that are sort of shared. And I do think as we go through these things, those points will be interesting. Because for the most part, you're right. They do seem to be fundamentally distinct sort of streams, but not completely.
Not completely. And obviously the main connecting point is Randolph Carter, because he's introduced in the Cthulhu Mythos.
Yes, Azathoth as well, I would say. The entity. Yeah.
The only other point I'll make on this is that Yog-Sothoth, when through the Gates of the Silver Key, is a fundamentally different character than the Yog-Sothoth of the Dunwich Horror, which makes me think it's a parallel reality.
That's an interesting point, though I'm inclined to believe there's no coincidences with things like names. So the reuse of that name is going to be meaningful. But that's fair. You could certainly conceptualize these things as...
Sure.
Yeah.
So,
Reflections, let's say. Yeah.
but my point is, when thinking about Lovecraft and his sort of like way of thinking, so within the Cthulhu mythos and within the horror elements within it, there's a sort of like tropes and patterns where as the horror escalates and reaches its climax, the idea being is that what is ultimately being seen or sensed or perceived couldn't possibly be real. And usually either the character goes mad, faints, or dies. And so there's this idea that each step in the link of the horror is based on some sort of rational conclusion. Well, that's reasonable, that's reasonable, that's reasonable. But then you get to the final conclusion, and it's an impossibility. And in fact, Lovecraft is famous for using, oceans of ink to describe how indescribable something is. But one of the things that's interesting is the way you think. So earlier in my life, I dealt with a pretty severe candida infection. And when you have fungus in you like that, it changes how you perceive the world and think about it. And as I've overcome that, looking back at Lovecraft, the way his characters see the horror in the universe around them, the way they perceive the universe, the way they reason to their conclusions of unmitigated horror, seem to be, obviously not to the same degree. I wasn't on the verge of madness like Lovecraft, but the idea is that there seems to be a pattern that having fungal infections leads you to think a certain way. Fungi have a huge impact in Lovecraft's writing. He has poems called the fungi from Yuggoth. Fungi are throughout the Great Race of Yith as a fungal species. One of the stories I think that really highlights this is The Shunned House, where basically there's this vampiric monster in the basement of this house, and it's associated with fungi, and it drains the health of people. So when he goes into the history backstory, he talks about Mercy, Dexter, and Anne White, who were both, he makes it clear they were both of sound body and mind, but they gradually just deteriorated away into nothing. We also see with the uncle of the protagonist, he's also of sound mind and health, and then this Dr. Elliot Whipple, but then is completely destroyed by this creature who has this like fungal quality. It slowly corrodes and erodes and eventually destroys him. We see a similar, no, it's not a fungus, it's the color out of space, but with the Xenos family, we see the same thing. They can't move. They're like locked in place and they just slowly rot away. Like so many people we see today, like almost like bugmen. And so there seems to be this connection between fungi being stuck in place, damp, dark buildings, and Lovecraft himself was never of good health. Now, I don't know exactly what his health was, but I wouldn't be surprised if he had some sort of a fungal infection, which led to him seeing things differently in a sort of skewed and troubled way.
It's a very interesting hypothesis about Lovecraft himself. I don't know either off the top of my head what the nature of his health problems were. However, when you point out the environments, I think you mentioned like dark, dank houses and such. I mean, that does sound like an environment for cultivating mushrooms. Just as there's even sort of vulgar jokes about that. So that is very interesting. I mean, these are also, that's an insalubrious environment, right? It's the opposite of what your common sense tells you is sort of good for your health, which you could say for the bugman lifestyle in general. I'm interested to hear more about your observations from the inside of having that sort of experience with the cognitive impact of interaction with a fungus like that. And I would also add that the Mi-Go are a fungal race as well from the Whisperer in Darkness.
Yes. So one of the things that struck me in a totally unrelated context is a lot of like the left-wing hippie types who love to smoke, the fungus, to get high. They'll talk about the mycelium network, which is the way in which fungi interact with each other. And they euphemistically call it nature's internet, right? They euphemistically call the mycelium network nature's internet, where like these fungi can send messages to each other over vast distances. In fact, the largest single organism is a giant fungal network somewhere out in the American West. And so if we view the mycelium network as sort of like nature's internet, might it be the case if a critical mass of fungi are represented in a human being, that human being can be kind of, for lack of a better word, an oracle for the mycelium network, where not that it's conscious. I'm not saying the mushroom is conscious, but there's some sort of communication going on which is affecting the human.
That is an interesting hypothesis. Now, even in your sort of new age types, I don't know if they posit that this communication is able to occur without a physical connection, right? You mentioned that, yeah, the largest known organism is this fungal entity that is this like underground. I looked this up in advance of this. I forgot what it is now, but yes, it's this massive structure that lives underground and across like several acres. I want to say it's truly enormous. But even talking about that, the notion is that information would be transmitted within the thing. So I do think if we're talking about things that are not physically connected, where I don't know if we're in the realm of the physical or the metaphysical, but that's not to say that what you're describing couldn't be, that you couldn't have some kind of resonance with these mycelium networks, right, that are on the same wavelength to kind of, I don't mean that literally, that they're radio communicating, but you see what I mean.
Right. So another thing too, there was this documentary. It was documentary about Lovecraft I saw a few years back. I don't remember the name of it, but I know it had Guillermo del Toro in it. And one guy was saying, "Oh yeah, there's a crazy group of Lovecraft fanatics who argue that the gods of the aliens of the Lovecraft mythos were using him as their oracle." And this was like some sort of like atheist fan. It was just sort of dismissing it out of hand as some childish thing. But okay, no, I'm not saying that the Mi-Go or Cthulhu are like using him as a vehicle to communicate their message. But the idea that something was using them to communicate a message, I don't think is entirely unrealistic. The other reason why I think this is, again, I guess if someone hasn't had to deal with a fungal infection before, and this is not something that would have been easily recognized or treatable in the 1920s or 30s. It's hardly recognized or treatable today. And so it changes how you view things. It's almost like, to use the example of like 2001: A Space Odyssey, when HAL, the computer's getting shut down, you're losing capacities. Like there's certain capacities you're unable to access. And then what you do perceive is altered in a negative way. Now, if you take that to an extreme, then you might end up envisioning monstrosities. Furthermore, fungi are used to, isn't ayahuasca in some sense a fungus? Because it's a way to like tear the veil to the supernatural. So what if, now I'm not saying anybody was doing this intentionally, but if fungi are used to get to these altered states of consciousness where you then tear the veil between this world and the other world, maybe we could say that, the Cthulhu Mythos and the dream cycle are two different versions of the parallel invisible world that is next to our own. Might it be the case that if, say, Lovecraft was infected with fungus to a degree, because that made him terminally ill, and he was terminally, very ill most of his life, might that then have eroded, in some sense, his perception of the other side? But it's not a perfect perception, and so that could lead to terror.
Well, you said eroded. Do you mean like eroded the barrier between him and the other side?
Yes. Yeah. In the same way that if you took ayahuasca, but it's not ayahuasca. It's a much more reduced level, but enough to tear the veil.
Right. So to your earlier point about being an oracle, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, Jung talks about this. Many others talk about this. The notion that these ideas have an existence outside of the substrate that carries them, right? Like think of a sound wave. The sound wave moves through the air, but the sound wave isn't the air, right? It is transmitted by the air. It's a reasonable metaphor for things like ideas, or perhaps the shape of the thoughts. So to apply that here, that Lovecraft could have been attuned to something like this, and perhaps because of a biological malady or just a sensitivity of spirit, been able to see things that others didn't, and then he was able, due to his craftsmanship, to render them such that we could read it. I think that's a perfectly reasonable hypothesis. Your notion as well of the Cthulhu mythos and the dream cycle then being different ways of expressing this sensitivity, I do think is interesting, because as we mentioned, they touch at certain points. They're different, but I mean, they were produced or at least expressed by the same person. So there's going to be commonalities there. And let me think, there was one other point that you made that I wanted to touch on, which I lost now. So I'll give it back to you.
Okay, the other piece of evidence in this theory is Yukio Mishima, the Japanese samurai wannabe darling of the alt-right. He was also notoriously ill of health until he started basically exercising outdoors around the age of 40. And my brother mentioned something that he wrote where he actually does comment on being like shut in and being sick, and the connection with fungi. And of course, going out in the sun is going to kill the fungus. And so Mishima basically he was in Lovecraft's, lifestyle throughout most of his life, this sick shut-in. And then he somehow broke it. And I think that's very interesting because Lovecraft never broke it. And so the idea then becoming that, given that, so here's the thing, right? So with the mycelium network as this sort of conduit of some kind of information or signal, as industrial civilization and urbanization continues at pace, where we have more and more people being permanent shut-ins, and which we now call bugmen, might it be the case that, now he makes it in the sense of cosmic horror, which I think is misplaced, but is the cosmic horror that he's feeling this sort of like upcoming century of the bugman trapped inside with fungus with no way to get out?
Yes, I think there is I think that's a very good reading, and I think we see it echoed elsewhere. Like in preparing for this, I was thinking about where does fungus come up, and Bap talks about fungus. He talks about yeast, right? Yeast as the symbol of the sort of bugman civilization, this life that just grows horizontally with no actual purpose, no vertical element to it. So I do think that he was very sensitive to that as the shape of the coming century.
No,
the other
go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, though, he expressed it in terms of cosmic horror. But of course, it's not the cosmos that's forcing us to live in the longhouse and get sick with fungus. It's industrial civilization itself.
Yes, although the difference is small when you're caught when you're just tossed by the tide. You know what I mean? The nature of the wave that you're in is going to matter much less than what it does to you. So I think you're right, and I think that's also, that notion of being tossed about by forces far beyond oneself is of course central to Lovecraft, and also to, I hate to say, the cosmos that he presents, because the nature of the horror is specifically anti-cosmic, right? Because cosmos is order. His horror is a universe which revolves around chaos, which rather than having a stable cosmic center has an unstable chaotic center, which I think would also describe the 20th century and the sort of environment in which this yeasty, fungal way of being expresses itself.
Well, the other thing too. Now this is a little okay. This is also going to be a bit of a stretch, but bear with me. I think I can make this case. I think Lovecraft is also dealing with Toxoplasmosis gondii, which is a parasite that you can get with dealing with cat feces, which makes you love cats. He loves cats. You have they play a large role in the Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, but they're introduced in the Cats of Ulthar, and so there does seem to be, again, there's a subculture here, right, where you have cats and dwarves, right? I don't know if that was his upbringing. Again, I don't know the particulars of his own upbringing in life, but it wouldn't surprise me that would color his view of cats. Now, there's nothing wrong with liking cats, but I think it's a little excessive at times, which makes me wonder, did he have a parasite too, which also would affect the way you think?
It would. And this notion you touched on before of a reduction in capability enabling you to see things differently. I think we also, that struck a chord with me. I'm trying to remember the exact reference because I think it was actually, wasn't it Van Gogh? I think it was Van Gogh who experienced something. I want to say he had head trauma or something that that interfered with his vision. And so, yes, perhaps he was unable to resolve things that he saw visually to the degree of that he could previously. However, arguably, he saw different things that he wasn't able to see before as a result of it too. So I think that this notion of these sort of infections or maladies as in a way reducing capability while opening new door. God closes the door and opens a window, I suppose. I think there's plenty of evidence for that in many other places.
Because again, there's a strange anti-logic, because you're right, like Lovecraft revolves around chaos, his anti-cosmos with his monsters and ultimately Azathoth. But the issue here is there's a sort of just almost fractal or cracked way of thinking. And a really good example of this comes from the Call of Cthulhu. And he said, this is from the one survivor of the ship that actually finds the Cthulhu Island. There were Donovan, Guerrera, and Engstrom. Parker slipped as the other three were plunging frenziedly over endless vistas of green crusted rock to the boat. And Johansson swears he was swallowed up by an angle of masonry which shouldn't have been there, an angle which was acute but behaved as if it was obtuse. So only Bryden and Johansson reached the boat and pulled desperately for the alert as the mountainous monstrosity flopped down slimy stones and hesitated, floundering at the edge of the water. I mean, this whole thing has like an anti-consistency to it. It's consistent in its absurdity, which is weird because if it's absurd, there shouldn't be consistency. And I think that the consistency is in part from, like, for lack of a better word, the Fungus's point of view.
So it's the bounded rationality of the irrational. It's the logical frame of a thing which is itself anti-logical. Well, anti-logical, that's an interesting one. So if you notice, when he does talk about things like Azathoth and the other gods, they're voiceless. And that struck me a lot in recently reading through it. Voiceless, without logos, right? They have no words. So what you're saying is it would be consistent from the view of such a creature. Now, I do wonder if we're getting into something akin to postmodernism here, and if this could have actually been Lovecraft reacting to this in his. Obviously, he was an anti-modern person himself, but he would have seen these sort of currents and reacted to them negatively. But this sort of aggressive anti-rationalism seems almost sort of Dadaist.
Well, yeah. What's interesting again is Lovecraft is okay. He strikes me as one of those socially conservative types at the turn of the last century who wanted to hold on to the old traditions, but didn't believe it was possible in the light of modern science. And again, Randolph Carter is his clear alter ego insert. And in Through the Gate with the Silver Key, we see that Randolph Carter is like, well, I can't really believe in what my Puritan forebears believed because science has disproven it. But the people who believe in science to replace them are even more confused, more at fault. And so Lovecraft is trying to preserve some element of what came before, but still within the light of modern science. But then this just begs the question, right? If his aristocratic spiritual side was still getting through, even as you said, there is a touch points in the dream cycle with the Cthulhu Mythos, so it's not a complete break. Might one suspect that, you know, again, not to be Freudian here, but his atheism was a result of fungus, which if you got rid of it, he would just be writing dream cycle stories. He'd be a Tolkien.
Perhaps. I mean, there's a distinct romanticism that comes through in the dream cycle, right? Especially in Kadath, where we reach the end and we see the goal is this utopia is in nostalgia, right? It's in this longing for the past. Now, what you're hitting on is that past is gone and we can't return. And perhaps that actually is, I mean, if he were himself, if he pulled a Mishima and Sun and Steeled his way out of his, you know, sort of sickly past, would he have seen a path? That's a good question. You know, obviously we'll never know because he didn't live to write it, but it does make you wonder if he would have landed at some form of riding the tiger.
Well, I mean, what if Lovecraft found his Mishima route and was like the American Tolkien, and then they met up sometime in the 50s or 60s?
If Lovecraft and Tolkien had met, that would be very interesting.
If Lovecraft had fixed his health, the Mishima route, you know, that's a distinct possibility.
Yes. I mean, Lovecraft was, of course, an Anglophile. I don't know what he would have thought of the work of Tolkien, but to your point, like, they do very different things, right? So that even in the dream cycle, it's not really a mythopoetic work like that produced by Tolkien. So even though he is very fond of sort of the Anglos, I get a more, I touched on romanticism. I think I get that kind of more sort of Faustian longing, I suppose. You know, it's more, I wonder if there's more of a Germanic kind of character coming through, because he doesn't seem to be downstream of the mythological tradition in the way that Tolkien is. But you do have to wonder if there is a despair to this sort of chaocentric vision that he has, and if it is influenced by his own sort of maladies, and if they were cleared up, if he would have seen it differently.
Well, because I know we're all going on long shot leads here, but the dream cycle is just so qualitatively different. Like not everything in the Cthulhu Mythos, but most of it is just grotesque, horrifying, ugly, and terrifying. Whereas the dream cycle is ethereal, beautiful, winsome, and mystical. And it's like, those are like totally opposite principles. And I think that Lovecraft, his true self, is expressed in Randolph Carter. Remember, that's his alter ego. That's another reason why I think this. It's well known that that's his alter ego. So if that's who he really wants to be, if that's who he really is, then it's not the guys in these stories with Cthulhu. It's Randolph Carter. And even in the Randolph Carter series, the old man is a good guy. Like, people are flipped. The old man in the first story is introduced and kills the three boys that come to harass his house. But in the story with Randolph Carter, he's a good guy. Yog-Sothoth is a good guy. Like everything is inverted into a whole nother elevated dimension.
And to touch on the Randolph Carter parallel into Kadath, of course, Tolkien Tolkien. Now I'm getting them mixed up because we're talking about them both. So Lovecraft, obviously very fond of cats, and the cats are a significant ally to Carter in Kadath. They interact several times. He talks to them. They help him. He helps them. That is very funny. But let's see, is Carter, so also as to Carter being his alter ego, it is interesting in that he has these grand adventures, right, in the dream, over the course of the dream cycle, but he's not he's not a conquering hero, right? He's not John Carter. He's or a a Robert E. Howard kind of protagonist. He he's very courageous, but he always kind of lucks out and gets by with a little help from his friends. He doesn't really what he achieved. Like he has daring, right? Daring, and I suppose a persistence. Like he doesn't give up, even though he encounters some amazing horrors there.
Right,
So
in the dream quest, it's all a product of his mind, because he wakes up and he realizes that the dream he was chasing was the architecture of providence, which lines up with the opening statement Through the Gate with the Silver Key, because he says that the scientists who discount dreams and visions, he says dreams and visions are the only truth. That's like a very like ancient, like, almost Abrahamic mindset, which is not odd in the sense that Lovecraft loves the Puritans. They figure, in a lot of his writing. So it's not totally surprising that he would do that, but there's a connection there. There's a connection that Randolph Carter has a dream quest all in his head. And then the final story in the mythos of the dream cycle has Randolph Carter say that the only truth is in dreams.
Well, you're right. That is certainly the revelatory vision, right? Or the notion that I suppose it's somewhat rationalist, but not even rationalist, because even in the rationalist case, you're not deriving truth via, say, empirical observation, but it is still through sort of the product of the rational mind, as opposed to revelation, in which it is revealed, right? So you're right that is the sort of point of view of the prophet, or of one who looks to prophets to give truth. Although your notion that the dream quest is all in his head, or the dream cycle is all in his head, I do think it's interesting.
Just Kadaf.
Okay. Because as I say, that's an interesting thing to discuss, because I mean, there's reason to believe it's not, right? Like there are the presence of Quranis.
Well, like Sell a Face, the guy dies.
Right.
Uranus dies. No, I was only saying that Kadaf was in his head, because it says as he's falling through the illimitable eons, being chased by Nyarlathotep, he realizes that it's all in his head, and he wakes up.
That's right. Yeah, he chooses to not, fall into the infinite gnawing chaos at the center.
Which is interesting, right? Because that would actually sort of buttress my fungal theory, right? Because if it's a state of mind that is being induced, then you could always reject it in theory.
Perhaps. But of course, I mean, if you do have this sort of overwhelming infection, it can defeat your body's attempts to counter it.
Yes.
So.
Well, but again, I'm only saying that it would be reasonable to conclude at a certain point in the process that you could choose to resist right. If this were an outgrowth of cosmic horror, it would do you no good to will differently, because it's hopeless. There's nothing you can do. It's the cosmos. Go ahead.
Sorry. No, just that is a very good point. That is an angle that I hadn't considered before. But no matter, you can't click your heels 3 times and say there's no place like home and escape from Cthulhu, right? You just get smashed and drowned. Whereas that you pretty much do in the dream cycle, or in the dream quest in particular. It's very much like the Wizard of Oz, actually, if you think about it.
Well, think about this, right? Nyarlathotep, he represents the outer gods. And what I love about the dream Kadaf is how it makes reference to all the older stories, because there's Barzai the Wise, who gets destroyed by the outer gods, presumably Nyarlathotep, and yet Randolph Carter is the second one to only see the gods of Earth and get away with it. So why was Barzai the Wise defeated but not Randolph Carter? Well, Randolph Carter woke up. He realized it was a dream. So you could argue that Barzai the Wise was someone more advanced in the, quote, infection than Randolph Carter, a.k.a. Lovecraft, and couldn't will it away. He didn't wake up. He didn't realize it was just something to wake up from.
That does make you wonder about these other characters who inhabit the dreamland. So you mentioned Barzai the Wise. There's Atal as well. That's the like apprentice who accompanies Barzai in The Other Gods. He's a young boy in the Cats of Ulthar, and then he's an old sage in the Dream Quest when Randolph Carter meets him. So this notion that these people with whom he interacts could be in a way similarly afflicted, but in a way such that they can't wake up. I mean, to think of it, I mean, it's sort of a, I'm coming to the Matrix here and thinking through this, and the notion of, it's tenuous because I hadn't thought about this before, but it seems to me related about how, obviously if you die in the Matrix, you die in real life. But then at the conclusion of the Matrix, Neo effectively just chooses not to die after being killed in the Matrix.
Yeah. Another element, this is coming from the Cthulhu Mythos, but it's directly relevant to what we're talking about, is Dr. Willett's confrontation with Joseph Curwen in the case of Charles Dexter Ward in the prison cell. I have told no one. This is no common case. It has madness out of time and a horror from beyond the spheres which no police or lawyers or courts or alienists could even fathom or grapple with. Thank God some chance has left inside me the spark of imagination, that I may not go astray in thinking out this thing. You cannot deceive me, Joseph Curwen, for I know that your accursed magic is true. So, despite the fact that this knowledge about the immortal wizard Curwen would be unacceptable to most highly educated men within the mundane world, Willett can still see it. Why? Because he has the spark of imagination. He hasn't lost it yet. And so this ties right back into the dream cycle with Kadath and Through the Gate with the Silver Key. In fact, the Silver Key itself, where it's introduced, it's the key that opens up the doors of imagination. So imagination, dream, the real truth, according to Lovecraft, if we take my reading of the dream cycle as predominant of his true beliefs, then there's a sense in which losing that imagination, it's almost Nietzschean, right? You choose to believe and have imagination, even though the sort of religious impulses that gave rise to it, you now no longer believe in. Because if you don't, you will be swallowed up by Nyarlathotep.
Lovecraft, the Ubermensch.
I know, right?
But yeah, not an obvious one, given, obviously that he was sickly in that way, but it does speak to this. It is a consciously non-rational decision to overcome. I believe that's the sort of the Nietzschean notion of overcoming as well. But yes, I mean, I do think there is something to that, and especially given that Lovecraft was very up on the scientific discoveries of his day, right? Like the one that I always think of is the fact that Pluto, I want to say, was discovered while he was writing about Yuggoth, the ninth planet, or this thing, and he got incorporated into the story. So he was very cognizant of these things, and you see it in the dream cycle a lot, particularly in stories like Polaris, where he's kind of flexing his knowledge of astronomy about all the things that he can name here. So he was very up to date on these, and I don't have citations off the top of my head, but it also does make me think of the advancements in physics that were occurring at this time, right? This was shortly after special relativity. I don't remember when general relativity was published, but I think it was at the same time that Lovecraft was active. So we do see this collapse of the Newtonian universe, right? And it kind of goes, I suppose, to what you were saying about science has robbed this imaginative quality from us, and yet we have to choose it in order to not be destroyed by these other gods of chaos. It's a pretty good read of Carter and Barzai, I suppose.
I mean, to my knowledge, nobody's made that reading, but the last time I finished the dream cycle and then revisiting it again for our future project, it makes me just feel like, how is this not connected in some important way? Because I feel like, okay. What's the whole ending of the dream cycle begins with the Silver Key. And the silver key is the key to everything. It's the key that opens up dreams. It's the key that allows Randolph Carter to talk to God, Yog-Sothoth, who's actually not a monster in this version. Well, if Randolph Carter is Lovecraft, and the silver key is the key to understanding the dream cycle, is the dream cycle the key to understanding the rest of Lovecraft's work?
It may be. I think it certainly is the key to seeing it with more depth, right? Like we touched at the beginning about the way that sort of Lovecraft flew under the radar and then became popular, but the elements of Lovecraft that are popular are the shallow ones and not the deep ones. Ha, deep ones. But actually, the deep ones would be one of those shallow things, right? Fish people who's scary, and they are scary, and it's great. I enjoy the Shadow over Innsmouth. However, I do think that the depth comes in with the consideration of the dream cycle. So the notion that the dream cycle is the silver key is a reasonable way to look at it.
Right, and so this focusing on dreams and the importance of dreams is in the Call of Cthulhu. There's the painter sculptor Wilcox, and he said it is new indeed. Young Wilcox's rejoinder, which impressed my uncle enough to make him recall and record it verbatim, was of a fantastically poetic cast, which must have typified his whole conversation, in which I have since found highly characteristic of him. He said, "It is new, indeed, for I have made it last night in a dream of strange cities, and dreams are older than brooding Tyre, or a contemplative Sphinx, or garden-girdled Babylon." Which is another way of saying that dream is where everything comes from. Dream is primary, right? That seems to be, or thought is primary, which seems to be what Lovecraft is getting at. And also, we have, I can't find the exact quotation, but he also mentions the importance of dream. And again, the through the gate with the silver key, where the dream is the truest truth. So it's funny, right? He's very up to date on the scientific discoveries of his day. Another example would be the Mountains of Madness. He goes into a lot of detail about like contemporary paleontology. And a lot of people read this in a like one-dimensional way and thinking that Lovecraft is all in favor of this. But I don't think he is. I think he wants to be erudite and converse with the minds of his own day. But he takes his almost anti-rationalist perspective throughout most of his work. So I don't think that's a correct reading of Lovecraft.
I completely agree with that. I think the dream cycle shows it and kind of goes to the point that we've been spinning around here. Now, to the notion of the primacy of dreams, I did mention before about sort of Jung's take on ideas, right, as moving through the substrate of the minds, but dreams are also super central to Freud. I mean, like Freud's wasn't his first major work not on the interpretation of dreams. Like the dream interpretation is absolutely key to Freud's whole method. So this notion that dreams give you insight at least into the nature of the mind is well entrenched, right? And that they're able to provide you a look at the functioning of the mind underneath what it would like you to see, right? Without the obfuscation that it puts in your way, the dreams manage to slip through. So then it goes to, well, what is the nature of mind as applied to the cosmos, right? Because you're saying, is it the key to more than just the person? Like, is there something truer there in an objective, by which I mean sort of external to that one person sense coming through the medium of dreams? And once again, once we get into this radical physics that came out, you actually don't find too terribly many atheists among those pioneers of the early to mid 20th century in physics, do you?
No. In fact, Max Planck in the 1930s gave a lecture saying that atheism would be poisonous to the scientific process. So, yeah, it doesn't leave much doubt there. But So what's interesting is what even before I knew the dream cycle, right? What Lovecraft is really good at is creating this like parallel world to the world that we live in. It's supposed to coexist with the world we live in, but in a way that we don't directly perceive, which in all prior ages would have been spiritual and supernatural. Now, in the Cthulhu mythos, these are materialistic creatures from outer space. Kind of goes in line with what Ernst Jünger said, that technique is the metaphysic of the 20th century. So, given that that's the metaphysic of the 20th century, that's how Lovecraft describes this sort of parallel reality that everybody was familiar with. But again, and this is just me going on a limb, but because he's more attuned to it because of his poor health due to possibly fungus, because again, he writes about fungus all the time in his works. It seems like it's something that he's familiar with. Now, I don't know if anybody at the time would have been able to diagnose him as, oh, you have a candida infection, Lovecraft, but regardless, you're going to be able to then see things, right? It's not a dose as strong as like ayahuasca or something. So you're not going to like completely go through the veil, but you're going to see like pinpricks in the veil. And especially if you're not, say protected by spiritual grace, and you just somehow get lost and wander into some part that you're not supposed to be, I can imagine that'd be quite terrifying.
Oh, that's absolutely true. I think that's a very reasonable case to make about the use of psychedelics, right? In that they do seem to weaken the veil, and there are other ways of achieving these states, right? In many traditions, you have things like fasting or sort of repetitive chants that are able to produce these states non-pharmacologically, but then there are methods of doing it pharmacologically. However, when you do this through a sort of wisdom tradition, the tradition itself seems to give you spiritual armor, let's say. It's a framework, cognitive armor, maybe, a framework through which to interact with the metaphysical that you're confronted with. So if you have actually been initiated into this tradition, right, and you have built your, say, spiritual armor, when you come face to face with a demon, it might not destroy you. However, if you are just, say, here because you did ayahuasca without the tradition, or you have just consumed some psychedelic mushrooms, or maybe you're just ill, then such a confrontation could destroy you. And maybe that's a way of reading what happened to Barzai as well. It does make you wonder. Yes, it makes me wonder. Then, what does it tell us about the fact that Carter was able to escape?
Yes. And so if my theory is correct, right, this wasn't Lovecraft pursuing forbidden lore. It was just sort of bad luck that these vistas were opened up to him, because clearly an author writes about what he is familiar with, right? Because you don't write about what you don't know. But like, what physiological experience, what experiences could Lovecraft have had? So right, we have a fact. Lovecraft was a man who was physically ill, who had a disordered mind, but wrote these wonderful stories. And it's like, okay, well, those are the facts. So how do we then explain and interpret those facts? So I'm going to go back to Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes, right? You look at the facts and then you reason backwards through a plausible chain of events that could have got you here. Now, we do this all the time. Forensics does this with a cadaver, right? You call the forensic investigator to see how someone died, and then he comes to the conclusion of the best evidence. And then that might be, how the police start their investigation. If you have a plane crash and you want to determine what malfunction went wrong, you have to have somebody that reasons backwards. What I would argue is what I'm doing is exactly that. And looking at what Lovecraft wrote, and then using that as clues, and then looking at Lovecraft's health, I think this is a very plausible explanation for what is going on.
I would also think about the folkloric history of fungus here as well. So you may have heard of fairy rings, right? These like fungal growths in the forest that in folklore have been associated with, say, the fae, like where fairies would come out and potentially whisk you away to somewhere else. So there's a long tradition of this association of fungus or mushrooms with the gate, with the border between life and death, right? Somewhat with metamorphosis, less so than like amphibians, which are also sort of boundary creatures, but it's a boundary, right, or a door. So the notion that if you are possessed by this being, which has itself a sort of shares a nature with the veil, that you might be in closer contact with it, is not ridiculous at all.
Well, think about this too, right? Fungi are directed towards some goal in their existence. Growth, right, is one of them, and the mycelium network helps communicate to facilitate that. Now, the chief god of the Lovecraftian mythos in both, well, okay, is either Yog-Sothoth or Azazoth, right? It's Yog-Sothoth and through the gate with the silver key, but in the Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, it's Azazoth. But here's the thing: Azazoth is blind and doesn't direct anything, but there's still some sort of process unfolding. Isn't that what a fungus is? A blind process unfolding?
That is what it is. Yes. I mean, that's the sort of the it's life which exists only to propagate, right? And if you know, what does Azathoth do at the center of everything? He gnaws. He sort of eats, right? But it's also, I would say, point out, lightless there. So he's blind and in a place without light and forever eating, which actually kind of does sound to describe fungus, doesn't it? So when we say, I think you had touched before about sort of Lovecraft being like an oracle, I want to say was the word you used. And I think that's right, because you could make a mistake and say that he was sort of possessed by this thing and then it was its avatar, right? But that's actually not it, because he's portraying this, he seems to have a knowledge of this fungoid nature that is sort of coming through him, that he can see it or sense it in some way. But his response is revulsion, right? It's not, I for one welcome our new fungoid overlords. It's, well, perhaps that gets to the point where you had mentioned earlier about how he spilled gallons of ink describing the indescribable. That notion of a fungal existence which exists only to, say, expand horizontally rather than vertically, I think that's a good way of conceptualizing it, is utterly horrifying.
Right, and a lot of the monsters, they're portrayed as morally evil in the literary sense, but Lovecraft is always telling you they don't care about us. They're just these impersonal forces. Well, again, right, a fungus that's growing and gnawing doesn't really care about you. You might be in the way, you might not be. It might do something horrible to you, it might not. But it has nothing to do with you or its own motivations.
That gets to something that I find very interesting about Lovecraft's conception of sort of this evil and horror, in that if you look at a very sort of Christian notion, say, of evil, it's an inversion of the hierarchy, right? It's placing the low above the high. Like that's what the inverted pentagram is. That's the nature of Lucifer's rebellion. It's an inversion of the hierarchy, or flipping it upside down. Whereas what Lovecraft seems to be showing you is not that, right? Because that does have this sort of malice. This is, it's like flipping it in the opposite dimension. Maybe if you think of it visually, it's not, say, making it upside down, it's making it inside out. Maybe you could think of it that way. It's that rather than say, okay, we've got this hierarchy and we're going to say put the low above the high. That's what evil is. He is saying, no, it's the opposite of this hierarchy, in which like the center is actually chaos rather than cosmos, right? In which it isn't this willful evil, it is this total lack of structure itself. I guess that's what it is. It's not the inversion of the hierarchy, it's the implosion of hierarchy, such that it's not even there, such that the organizing principle is disorganization.
Right.
Which is something I find interesting about him. Yeah.
Right. So what's going on is, for Lovecraft, now this is not something he welcomes, but like it's almost like the sunum bonum is the fungus. The fungus has replaced the beatific vision, and all of the universe is seen within the context of the fungus.
That's a good one-sentence summary. Yes, it is the universe of Fungus is this sort of, and it would be this sort of shapeless, utterly materialistic universe, wouldn't it? Like that's exactly what it would be if you think about it.
Yeah,
that is how you would see it.
Well, there's something from the Dunwich Horror that I was thinking about when we were talking about the fungus. This is about the fate of the known universe that the Whateleys were attempting to produce. Dr. Armitage slept, but was partly delirious the next day. He made no explanations to Hartwell, but in his calmer moments spoke of the imperative need for a long conference with Rice and Morgan. His wilder wanderings were very startled indeed, including frantic appeals that something in a boarded-up farmhouse be destroyed, and fantastic references to some plan for the extirpation of the entire human race, and of all animal and vegetable life from the earth by some terrible elder race of beings from another dimension. He would shout that the world was in danger since the elder things wished to strip it and drag it away from the solar system and cosmos of matter into some other plane or phase of entity from which it had once fallen vigintillions of eons ago. At some other time, he would call for the dreaded Necronomicon and the Daemonolatria of Remigius, in which he seemed hopeful to find some formula to check the peril he conjured up. I don't know. When I read that paragraph, it all kind of sounds like it sounds like an all-devouring fungus, where it just consumes everything.
It's decomposition, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, it's the reduction into gray goo. It's the globo homo, if you want to put it that way. Like it's removing all differentiation. And I thought it was interesting that you said plant and vegetable life. Now, of course, I suppose you could say fungus are vegetative and they don't move, but they're not plants. So I thought that was interesting, that what's going to be consumed sounds like animals and plants.
Yes.
Well, consumed by fungus.
Yeah. And the other thing is, okay, if we want to see clues to like the true Lovecraft, the sort of like aristocratic New England, patrician mythopoetic Lovecraft, his heroes who defeat the evil, so they defeat the fungus. Willet is, I don't think it's stated if he's a family man, but within the case of Charles Dexter Ward, Charles's father, who is of course a family man, is a colleague with Willett to help put down Kerwin. He hasn't read all of the Arcana and doesn't have quite the constitution to do what needs to be done, but he rises to the occasion to help Willett when he can. And of course, in the Dunwich Horror, where the evil is decisively defeated, Armitage, Rice, and Morgan are all family men. I mean, this is a very traditional, normal, non-subversive perspective. And one wonders if that's an echo of what was lost that Lovecraft is sad about. Because when you read about New England of the early 18th century in the case of Charles Dexter Ward, he's and also the backstory to the shunned house, he's very sympathetic to the life of these colonial Puritans, with the sort of like nostalgia and winsomeness, which indicates that that's what's been lost, that he wants. So it's very trad, in other words, right? His protagonists are very trad. And of course, in the first time Curran was defeated, the town all banded together and they stormed his dungeon. So it's these traditional upstanding members of the community that defeat this evil.
Yes, I have not detected any subversion within the works of Lovecraft. So, I mean, I think you're right that does come through in his choice of heroes, as well as in the nature of the things he finds so revolting. They tend to be sort of erudite men as well. I mean, I do think there's a lot of him that comes through in all of his characters, other than the evil ones. So they tend to be intellectual, right? They're not, and I'm trying to think if there are any who are lower class. Because of course Tolkien. We got them both going in my head here.
No,
Lovecraft does have a
Rains was low class.
who was sorry.
Uranus, who dies in
Oh,
space, he was of a lower
he
class
was
background.
well. He was poor, but if you remember, he was from a once notable family.
True.
So you see, that's the thing. That's like Lovecraft himself, or at least how he would view himself, right? Because I was going to get into. He does have a very Anglo view of class, as opposed to an American view of class, in which it is more strictly correlated with wealth. His view would be you could certainly be of high class but low wealth at this time, right? You could have fallen on generations of bad luck or whatever, but still be of a sort of noble house, perhaps on the outs.
Yeah. So that's pretty much all I have to deliver. Is there anything else you want to comment on before we wrap this up?
I don't think so. I think we ended up covering a lot of ground in a lot of unexpected directions. So I am looking forward to further discussions on the dream cycle.
All right. Well, thank you, the Doomsman. This is Todd Lewis, the Praise of Flight podcast, signing off.